the marriage of opposites and the resolution of dichotomies is one of the great indications of spiritual as well as psychological maturity. Last week, when I was a guest at Columbia, and a few of you were there, spoke about the personal-impersonal conceptual dichotomy. None of these things exist in reality. And how, for example, if we imagine God as personal in the sense of, a man with a beard sitting on a throne up on a planet somewhere, well, that's ridiculous. God is impersonal in that sense, as this separate individual being. And on the other hand, if we mean by impersonal, mechanical, or soulless in that broader sense, well then the absolute is not that either, even within Buddhism, because we have pure consciousness, pure awareness, which sounds really personal. So we call it transpersonal, if you will. That's a word people use in both psychology and theology today. But the point is we get beyond that, and we use the symbols for the absolute, etc., with a certain freedom. So remember, I was talking about, as I was reflecting or mulling over this last time, I became aware of the comparison between the sun and the moon in, for example, in Buddhism, just to use that, because there's a whole variety, even within the Buddhist tradition, of symbols for the absolute. And it seemed to me that the more personal the symbols became of experience and the absolute, the more they resembled fire rather than light, or the symbol of the sun, S-U-N, rather than the moon. Because in Theravada, and particularly in Zen, as we're practicing here, I realized that you'd have to look pretty far to find a symbol of the absolute, which was fire, the sun. It was almost always the moon. Remember, fingers pointing at the moon, the various traditions pointing at the moon is the absolute. And there are a number of examples of that, where the moon is seen as the brightness of wisdom. As a koan, for example, the 90th koan in the Blue Cliff Record, which speaks of what is the body of wisdom, and the response is an oyster swallowing the moon, or a rabbit getting pregnant. All right, now let me explain. The idea was that on a full moon, on the night of the full moon, when the oyster opens up, that's when they conceive, so to speak, the pearl. And then a symbol, therefore, for form, for relative reality, conceiving wisdom by opening up to the moon. And rabbits were supposed to also get pregnant at the full moon, so that's another way, bring forth the absolute. So even there, you have the symbol of the moon as an absolute reality. And the famous symbols of the absolute and the relative together, snow in a silver bowl. You can't distinguish the absolute from the relative. They're not the same, but they're not separate. Or a heron in a snowstorm. Notice how cold, how cool those images are. Because Zen, and this kind of passive receptive meditation, is rather cool. But as soon as you get to more personal representations, it becomes more fiery. So, and of course in Christianity, the sun is the symbol of God, or the sun of justice. The woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet. So in Christianity, the moon is more a symbol of reflected light, which was in us, in the church, or of changeability with the phases of the moon. But you do have, even within Buddhism, in addition to contemporary Buddhists who are starting to use God language in this richer, deeper sense, you've had very traditional symbols, for example, of Amitabha Buddha in the Pure Land school and the Tibetan school as well, Dhyani Buddha, who is symbol as fire and who's personified, as a bodhisattva. Or in Shingon Buddhism, the Shinyuan group that I work with, where you have the fire Buddha, Fudo Osatsu, that's one of the symbol of the highest realization. So you have these symbols of fire as symbol of an absolute realization. But it's interesting to compare how these symbols are used. I'd like to develop this idea now tonight about the idea that explore these images a little bit more within the broader tradition. I want to use as a starting point one of my favorite masters and one of my favorite koans, number 41 in the Blue Cliff record, Jiaozhou in Chinese, who has this wonderful koan, after you die the great death, how do you come back to life? So you have all the Easter death, resurrection kind of stuff here, but he's speaking in an entirely different, well, not an entirely different context, but a different culture, with the same notion. So you die the great death, you die to the ego, you die to all that keeps you from awakening to reality of the absolute and relative together, which is what Zen proclaims and Buddhism proclaims, Indian mystic proclaims. But you come back from that. How do you come back? And Joshu gives the answer. You must not come back by night, you must come back by day. Or, don't come back by moonlight, come back by sunlight. Come back to the day, don't stay in the moon. This reminds me of Carl Jung. Remember when I was studying that, he had these three phases, the death and the transitional period, if you want the tomb day, and the resurrection. And he used the colors. He said Good Friday was Nigredo, which was black, which was dying the great death. Then you had this intermediate period, Holy Saturday, if you will, which he termed Albedo, which is the white moonlight, the cool light, the passivity, if you like, a contemplative Holy Saturday in the tomb. But that was an intermediate stage. You don't come back. That's not the final thing. The Easter Sunday is Rubedo, which is red and fire, just like Amitabha Buddha. His color is red, as well as the element of fire. So you have that same fascinating sequence. So obviously, we're working a little differently here with the images, but I think it's very instructive, and we see even the great Master Joshu recognizing, fairly explicitly this sequence. And where I find it most developed, and this is very, again, instructive for us because it represents a real challenge for us, is a Jungian book on the tarot, which I read. And if any of you know anything about the tarot, you don't have to admit it. You don't have to admit it, but if you do, you know that after the death, the great heroes, after the death card, you continue and you get to the star, which is, your new self. You're finally beginning to awake. The next card is the moon, which is before the sun. Yes, you understand. And the sun represents the full integration, the full blossoming of wisdom. But in between the great death, if you pass through the moonlight, you better not stay there. You've got to get to the sun. And there's a whole temptation of staying in the moon. And this is a temptation which Buddhism itself has recognized, and also the great mystics of Christianity as well. You can't stay in the underworld, despite its intoxication and all the fascinating things you can find there. Because after you die, you discover all these fascinating things. You also have to be able to come back come back. How do you come back to life, Joshu? You come by day. You've got to reach the sun. And the Mahayana tradition says one of the great temptations, and sometimes they accuse their fellow religionists of this, rightly or wrongly, is that you stay in this absolute enlightenment thing and you never come back. You stay in this wonderful world separate from outside ordinary reality, and you never come back. You don't come back to life. You don't come back by day. That's a real temptation. You stay on the mountaintop and you stay apart. You don't come back to the world. Whereas you remember the ox herding pictures, the final stage in Zen, even though it speaks more about the moon than the sun, the final stage is coming back to the marketplace with open arms, bare-chested, with your heart open to have compassion on the world. You've got to come back. If not actually physically from the monastery, at least spiritually. And most people belong to monasteries anyway. But the point is, you come back, you make that final journey of compassion back from the great death to the day. You have to come back in and as the sun. This particular book, which is Tao and the Hero's Journey, I'm referring to, mentions a lot of the myths that actually. So this is not something they're making up recently. A lot of the myths actually have this as a part of the journey. I don't think it's been pointed out enough. Despite the dangers, as I just said, which are very real in the spiritual life, of staying there, apart. So, for example, Orpheus and Eurydice. You remember? Orpheus, Eurydice died, went into the underworld, into the tomb, and died the great death. And he went after her into the underworld, as all the heroes do, and he has to go into the underworld. That's part of dying the great death, part of the imagery of the transformation. But remember, as they came back up, he looked back, and she was lost. That full integration wasn't achieved because he looked back. He didn't keep going toward the sun. It's pretty fascinating. The story of the Ring trilogy, Wagner, Siegfried gets lost and doesn't recognize Brunhilde anymore and marries the wrong woman, and he dies. He doesn't succeed. He doesn't complete the journey. There's always a feminine figure here that's crucial, the anima figure. But you see, the idea is they don't come back. One way Jung speaks about this is and this is where the real danger is obvious. The real danger when you open up to this vast unconscious world, this vast mystical world, is inflation, ego inflation, megalomania. That's one way you don't come back. The ego doesn't fully die and it appropriates all this stuff as its own. One of the great parables of this, I saw an animated version when I was a kid, really impressed me. Remember the story of the fisherman and his wife? He finds this magical fish, and it says, the fish says, if you let me go, so I mean he's going down into the depths of the sea, okay. And the fish says, if you let me go, I'll grant your wish. So his wife, again, the feminine figure, can be very negative here, before it's integrated, says, ask for a new house. So he does, and then she says, no, ask to be count or a duke or something. Okay. Ask to be pope. All right. Ask to make the sun rise. And that collapses. You know who else went through this? Jesus in the desert. Right after his baptism, not to mention the death and resurrection, the passion and resurrection, but having entered into the reality, realized that he was the Son of God, you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. The baptism goes into the desert, the tomb area, and the temptation is, turn the stone into bread. Cast yourself down from the temple. Worship me. Same thing. Very to die as you become one with the sun. You do become one with the sun, whether it's S-U-N or S-O-N. But it's not you. You're completely joined to and transparent to the Absolute. You're one with it, but you disappear. To use the imagery of Teresa of Jesus, the candle is swallowed up by the sun, S-U-N, literally. That's not her image. Your little candle is just completely subsumed by the sun. So no megalomania here, if you come back in compassion. So I leave that with some of the imagery from my friend and colleague Ellen Burks, Roshi Ellen Burks, who has written on healing Zen and selfless love, and uses God language. She's a nurse. And she points out, we are God's love. That's another way of saying we become the sun. The woman clothed with the sun. It's us, not just Mary and the church, it's all of us. And we are fully clothed with the sun, and that means that we are God's love in the world. There's no distance between absolute and relative anymore. We are God's love in the world, as she says, very baldly and very boldly. And we simply are transparent to that radiant sun within us. We have to come back by day. So we're not only there during the day, we are the sun itself. We are the sun himself. But we've disappeared. The absolute is the relative and the absolute are one. But that's a good caution to keep that, keeping that imagery, to see what the dangers are as we make that journey. There's a lot of different traditions, as you see, and myths, and also seem to allude to this danger. And so where do we wind up? Well, we wind up as the sun, or, as Ellen Burke says, her Dharma name is Jikai, which means ocean of compassion. So now we're with water. All these images are very fluid. So hopefully we can, God is this great sea of being. So you can play with these concepts, but don't play around with what they're pointing to. When you die the great death, don't get caught in the enchanted forest. You can never get out. Go all the way through, come back by day. And become the sun.